She didn't even look back as she walked away from that pharmacy counter. Her eyes were full of tears, and she was already bracing herself to live without the heart medication she needed to survive. What she didn't know was that a retired Marine behind her was holding that same medicine in his hand, refusing to let her carry this burden alone. This wasn't charity. This was honor stepping forward when pride was breaking. If stories like this matter to you, like, comment, and subscribe. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. The fluorescent lights in the small Midwestern pharmacy hummed with a soft electrical buzz as late afternoon settled outside, turning Main Street into a dim watercolor of winter sky, parked trucks, and quiet sidewalks. In that half hour where workers stopped in for quick errands before heading home to supper, the pharmacy line held a handful of familiar faces who all knew one another by last name, even if they didn't speak much more than polite greetings. Evelyn Carter stood at the counter, holding a worn wallet between both hands as if protecting a small but fragile lifeline, waiting for the heart medication that helped her maintain steady rhythm through each day. Her posture was modest, reserved, humble, the posture of someone who never asked for much and never wanted to become a burden. And though nobody around her knew what was coming, the moment they were all living inside was one of those ordinary American minutes that would soon become unforgettable. Evelyn was a gold star mother, a quiet term spoken with reverence in small towns like this, because everyone here knew what it meant to lay a child to rest who wore the nation's uniform. She didn't talk about her loss often, because grief, when carried long enough, becomes a private language spoken only in whispers at night, not in public where sympathy can often feel like salt instead of comfort. But small towns remember things, and people like Evelyn become stitched into the unspoken fabric of community identity. Her son's funeral had been years ago, yet the folded flag still rested in a wooden case on her mantel, lit each morning by gentle sunlight that landed across the photographs she never moved from their designated place. She remained strong, dignified, and grateful for the blessings she still had, but living on a fixed income meant every small financial shift carried real weight. The pharmacy smelled of paper, sanitizer, and the faint sweetness of cinnamon gum packets lined neatly near the counter. A small bulletin board beneath the greeting cards displayed flyers for church suppers, VFW fish fries, and coat drives, reminders that this place, while small, held a steady heartbeat of community service. Scanner beeps echoed like small punctuation marks through the quiet, and every time the bell above the door chimed, cold air rushed in from the street like a whispered reminder that winter had not yet finished its grip. Yet in this simple environment, where receipts, dosage instructions, and whispered insurance explanations marked the rhythm of ordinary life, a deeper question was already forming, one that the people inside did not yet realize they were about to witness. Evelyn wasn't thinking about honor, sacrifice, or pride in that moment. She was simply focused on getting her medication and going home, the way she did every month, praying silently that insurance covered enough of the cost this time, so she wouldn't have to count every bill twice. She wasn't ashamed of needing medication, but she was careful with every dollar, because age had taught her that control begins to slip most not in dramatic events, but in small financial cracks that spread before you notice them. She would never allow herself to feel like a burden, not after raising a son who believed in service bigger than self, and certainly not after losing him to the very nation he swore to defend. For her, dignity wasn't pride, it was duty, something you hold on to even when your heart has already been broken once. Behind Evelyn, the other customers shifted casually, a lineman in work boots tapping his foot in patience, a high school senior in a school jacket scrolling through his phone, a mother with a toddler reading the cover of a Valentine's card. They weren't tense or impatient. This wasn't the city. This was a place where people understood that slowness is sometimes just part of life. And yet, these everyday witnesses stood unknowingly on the threshold of a moment that would remind them what their shared values actually meant. Because true honor is not loud. It does not introduce itself. It does not ask permission to appear. It simply walks into a moment and reveals itself as naturally as a sunrise. Evelyn, for her part, was simply hopeful everything would go smoothly. She had planned her week very carefully because the cost of everything, from utilities to groceries, had risen quietly in recent months, and she'd been tightening her budget more than she let on. She carried no sense of entitlement. She carried gratitude for every day she woke up with breath still in her body and memories still in her heart. But every time she stood at a counter like this, she felt tension creep in beneath her ribs, because she lived with the unspoken fear that one unexpected number could turn her balance of independence upside down. She prayed, softly, silently, that today would not be that day. And like so many people who carry both pride and pain, she did not realize she was not standing alone in that moment. Because behind her, waiting in that same quiet line, stood a retired Marine gunnery sergeant, a man who had worn the uniform not just as a profession, but as a lifelong commitment to principle, a man who had seen sacrifice up close and understood the language of pride without words. He did not yet know the details of what was about to unfold, but he carried within him an instinct honed through years of service, an instinct that recognized dignity in distress long before anyone else would. Honor, as it turns out, rarely announces itself before it acts. And this was one of those American days when dignity and service would quietly converge in the most ordinary of places, under fluorescent lights, at a pharmacy counter, next to a paper bag sealed with a printed label. This was a moment where principles would outweigh politeness, where compassion would outweigh comfort, and where the legacy of service would reach across the quiet space between two strangers. The kind of moment that reminds America, especially rural America, that decency still lives in the everyday. And as Evelyn stood there, unaware of how close she was to a humbling intersection between need and honor, the truth of the matter was this: sometimes the most powerful moral moments happen not in grand speeches, not in televised ceremonies, not in marble halls, but in the small places where no cameras exist and no applause is expected. In this pharmacy, in this late afternoon hush, a moral question was about to be answered not in theory, but in action, quietly, respectfully, and with a timeless sense of duty. No one in that line yet understood what was about to happen. Not Evelyn, not the cashier, not the teenagers scrolling through their phones, or the lineman waiting to pick up ibuprofen for his sore back. But in just a few moments, humility would collide with financial reality. Pride would attempt to walk away. And someone who had once served this nation in uniform would decide that service does not retire. It simply changes battlefield. The cashier finished typing Evelyn's information into the system and waited for the insurance database to return the final copay amount, the way she did dozens of times every day, without ceremony and without anticipation. But when the total appeared, her eyebrows raised ever so slightly, because it was higher than usual, noticeably higher. Something in the insurance structure had shifted. Maybe a deductible had reset. Maybe coverage had recalculated for the new year. But whatever caused it, the number on the screen was cold, unmoving, and indifferent. The cashier looked up with gentle reluctance, because she knew Evelyn, and she knew the meaning that numbers like this carried for people living on fixed incomes. Still, policy did not bend for compassion. It only displayed the total. Evelyn heard the number, and her heart sank just far enough for her breath to catch before she forced herself to stay poised. She quietly thumbed the edge of her worn wallet, the same wallet she'd carried for years, the same one she'd learned to count every dollar inside with careful patience. She slowly opened it and glanced at the bill she had planned so precisely that morning, the way she always planned. Because she didn't have room for error when prescription prices shifted without notice. Her throat tightened. She blinked twice. But she already knew, before counting, what the truth was. She didn't have enough. Humiliation is not loud. It doesn't slam doors or raise voices. It rises quietly, like steam off pavement after rain, subtle, uncomfortable, and deeply exposing. Evelyn felt that humiliation settle in her chest like an unwelcome weight, stealing warmth from her shoulders and leaving her feeling smaller than she'd felt in months. It wasn't that she hadn't survived worse. She had survived tragedy that most people never recover from. But this was different. This was small, but sharp, a reminder that even after a lifetime of sacrifice, the system did not protect her from moments like this. It was a reminder that sometimes the cost of independence becomes more painful than the cost of grief. She looked at the cashier and offered the faintest, most apologetic smile, the kind a person offers when they want to cushion the discomfort of everyone else in the room. And with that small gesture, she carefully closed her wallet and took a slow breath to steady herself. "I can't," she whispered softly, the words barely escaping her lips. It wasn't a dramatic rejection, it was resignation, acceptance, the instinctive silent retreat of someone trying to preserve dignity in the moment of defeat. The cashier felt her eyes sting for a split second, because she remembered the funeral years before, remembered the folded flag presented on that hillside cemetery, remembered the Marine Honor Guard saluting in silence beneath a sky that held more sorrow than sound. She wanted to do something, anything, to bridge the gap between what Evelyn needed and what she could afford. But policy is policy. Corporate structures do not rewrite themselves for grief or patriotism. There was no button she could press to make the moment easier. She could only watch. So Evelyn gently took the small white prescription bag, not into her hands, but with slow, deliberate movement. She slid it back across the counter toward the cashier. It was the kind of gesture that reveals more emotion than words ever could, because handing something back is not just surrender. It is an admission that survival will now require living in pain rather than asking for help. "I'll come back later," she said softly, as though she simply needed time, when in truth, she needed money she did not have. Her voice trembled, but she forced her shoulders to stay square, refusing to let her posture betray the emotional blow she had just taken. The young man in line behind her stopped scrolling his phone. The lineman shifted and paused his boot tapping. A mother with her child placed a card back into the rack without finishing reading it. Silence, real silence, spread across the room. Not the silence of normal business, but the silence that comes when people witness something delicate, painful, and deeply human. Everyone present now understood that something important was happening, not because anyone spoke, but because the emotional temperature in the pharmacy had changed. Evelyn wanted to leave quickly, not because she was angry, but because she did not want pity. She would rather go home without her medication than stand here another second feeling like someone who needed rescuing. She believed, fiercely, that if her son could sacrifice his life for the country he loved, then she could at least maintain enough strength to walk away from the setback without letting others carry her burden. Her dignity mattered. Her self-respect mattered. And even if this choice cost her physical health, she refused to take something she could not afford. Pride is often misunderstood, but for her, pride was simply the last piece of control she still possessed. And so she tightened her coat collar, closed her wallet, held back tears, and began to turn away from the counter, ready to step back into the cold winter air outside. The door, only a few yards ahead, might as well have been a mile away, but she would walk through it alone if she had to. This was her choice. This was her moment. And she believed she had no allies left in the room. But she was wrong. Because someone behind her, someone who had once worn the uniform, had already felt his jaw tighten when he heard her say, "I can't." And though Evelyn didn't know it yet, honor was already rising to meet her quiet heartbreak, silently, patiently, and with absolute resolve. Retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant James Jim Walker stood third in line behind Evelyn, hands resting lightly on the head of his cane, not because he needed dramatic support, but because the years of marching, deployment, and hard terrain had carved scars into bone and tendon that whispered to him in cold weather. He wasn't the type to insert himself into other people's private matters. Marines are trained to observe first, to assess, to understand before acting. But when Evelyn spoke those faint words of defeat, something shifted inside him with the force of memory, duty, and instinct. He had heard that tone before, in hospitals overseas, in homes of grieving families, in the quiet aftermath of folded flags being handed to hands that trembled while trying to accept both loss and honor in the same breath. That type of quiet pain is unmistakable. Jim didn't recognize Evelyn at first by face, but the moment she slid that prescription bag back, he felt a familiar sensation, the unmistakable emotional signal that a person was trying to hold on to dignity while their world pulled it from their hands. A Marine learns to read human subtlety like a map, the stiffness of her shoulders, the tiny hesitation before she whispered, "I can't," the way she turned slightly inward to not show emotion. Every part of it delivered a message. And though he didn't yet know her name, he knew with certainty she was someone marked by sacrifice still alive beneath her composure. His jaw hardened, not with anger, but with resolve, a silent declaration that he would not allow humiliation to finish its work. He remembered funerals, the kind with uniforms lined in rows, the folded triangles of flag, the quiet sobs of parents who stood taller than felt possible. He remembered the unspoken promise Marines carry long after the oath is signed. You do not let those left behind carry the weight alone. And though he'd left active duty years ago, certain instincts never retired. The instinct to protect dignity, the instinct to intervene when honor demanded it, the instinct to step in for someone who could not, or would not, ask. The lineman in front of him shifted his weight. The toddler near the card rack tugged on his mother's coat. The teenage student watched the scene with a quiet curiosity that masked how deeply this moment struck him. But Jim wasn't thinking about them. He had already tunneled into focus, the way Marines do when decisions have to be made without hesitation. He allowed himself one breath to confirm the situation, to replay the moment she said, "I'll come back later." And once he understood exactly what had happened, the next step was already inevitable to him. This wasn't charity. That distinction mattered. Charity can sometimes bruise pride. This was duty, not to the uniform he once wore, but to the principles underneath it, the belief that service binds Americans together, especially in small towns where families still hang photographs of their loved ones in uniform on the living room wall like sacred icons. Jim didn't yet know Evelyn was a Gold Star mother, but he sensed that her struggle wasn't just financial. It was layered with sacrifice and grief. She didn't want anyone to witness. Marines do not create scenes. Marines act quietly, strategically, precisely. So, Jim began mentally planning how he would intervene in a way that protected her dignity, rather than expose her vulnerability. He understood how fragile pride becomes when a person chooses to walk away rather than stay and ask for help. He had seen that too many times overseas, wounded soldiers refusing assistance because they didn't want to burden their brothers. This moment felt eerily similar, the battlefield replaced by pharmacy tile flooring, the stakes still running deeper than they appeared. And so he took a slow breath, eyes fixed not on Evelyn directly, but on the cashier's hand still hovering awkwardly above the return label screen, because that is where the intervention had to start. Marines do not insert themselves into emotional wounds by force. They go through protocol, through structure, through procedure, because dignity is protected by making help seem operational, not emotional. He knew he needed to speak to the cashier first, not to Evelyn, and he knew he had to phrase everything in terms of respect owed, not pity offered. His jaw tightened the way it did when making a final tactical call. He shifted one step forward, preparing to speak softly but firmly, because some words are not meant to be loud. They are meant to carry moral authority that does not need volume. He was aware of the line watching, but not distracted by it, because Marines learn to ignore the crowd and focus on the mission. Inside him, something powerful crystallized, the moment where intention becomes action. His heartbeat steady, his expression calm, but his decision immovable. This would not be the day Evelyn Carter walked out without the medicine her life depended on. It would not be the day her pride had to pay the price of systemic indifference. Jim didn't know her story yet, but he knew enough. And what he knew was all he needed. He would step forward, because someone had to, And because sometimes the fight comes to you in unexpected places. And if you still carry honor inside you, you answer that call every time. Evelyn took one slow step away from the counter, her coat sleeve brushing lightly against the edge, as if the counter was trying to hold her back for one more second before she left. She wanted to escape before her voice betrayed her and turned into something emotional she could not contain. Because once tears come in public, dignity feels like it fractures into 100 visible pieces. Her instinct was to withdraw, to get outside into the cold winter air, to walk away from this moment before anyone could say anything compassionate enough to make her break. For her, leaving was the only way to stay strong. But the moment she shifted her weight toward the door, she heard a calm voice behind her say, in a tone that was careful, measured, respectful, "Ma'am." "Excuse me just a moment." The cashier hesitated, torn between protocol and conscience, looking between Evelyn and the Marine now stepping closer. She understood what he was trying to do, she could feel it, but she also knew there were rules. Pharmacy transactions weren't as simple as handing money across the counter. Once a patient declined and the system initiated a return, the prescription label had to be scanned back into inventory, and that process was not quick. But the Marine didn't begin by asking to pay for it. He began by asking a procedural question, the kind that would allow her to keep Evelyn in possession of her dignity. "Is there a way to suspend that transaction for a moment?" he asked, voice low enough that it didn't broadcast to the entire room. It wasn't a direct offer, it was a tactical wedge. Evelyn felt her chest tighten again, not from humiliation, but from a different emotion entirely, fear of being exposed. She wanted to turn and say, "No, please don't," because giving someone the chance to help meant admitting she needed help. And needing help to her wasn't weakness, but it felt like an admission that she no longer controlled her own life. Control was the last currency she believed she still had. So she stood there, torn between gratitude and panic, unsure how to hold herself together long enough to avoid breaking. The cashier looked at the pharmacist, who was reviewing dosage interactions behind the partial wall at the back counter, and gave a small silent signal, an unspoken question asking permission to pause the process for 30 seconds. The pharmacist glanced up, recognized the situation instantly, and gave a subtle nod, not an instruction to break rules, but a permission to give the moment breathing room. The transaction wasn't reversed yet. The bag wasn't sealed back into inventory. There was still a window for dignity to survive intact. Jim took another small step forward, not in a way that intruded on Evelyn's space, but in the way Marines step into responsibility when the moment demands it. His hands remained at his sides, posture straight, voice steady, because he knew that if he spoke directly to Evelyn first, she would likely shut the moment down out of pride. So he addressed the cashier again, speaking a little softer now, as though the moment itself had become fragile and needed gentle handling. "Just hold that one for a second," he said. It wasn't a request, it was a protective shield. Evelyn's breath trembled. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, because this was the exact moment she had tried to avoid. She didn't want pity. She didn't want special treatment. And she certainly didn't want to become a story whispered about later. But something in the way the Marine spoke, careful, measured, quietly authoritative, made it impossible to label his intervention as charity. His tone carried something deeper, something rooted in shared sacrifice, something she recognized. It felt like respect, not pity. The teenager in line behind Jim swallowed hard. He wasn't old enough to grasp military protocol, but he was old enough to sense that something deeply meaningful was unfolding right in front of him, something adult, something principled, something that carried weight beyond prescriptions and cash registers. He watched with wide eyes, absorbing the fact that grown men still stepped up to defend people quietly, without applause, without audience, without cameras. The cashier still hovered in limbo, hands near the return screen, waiting for direction, because her training told her she had to reverse the sale unless the customer wanted it held. Yet the Marine's intervention rewrote the stakes. The moment was no longer about policy. It was about protecting someone's emotional spine before it snapped. The pharmacist now watched from behind the counter, silent, but fully aligned with what the Marine was attempting, because some decisions transcend procedure. Evelyn tried to speak, to decline help, to reclaim control, to put a boundary around her pride, but her throat locked. She managed to whisper, "Please, it's fine," but the words were weak, unconvincing, brittle like shattered glass. A person who is truly fine does not whisper through clenched vocal cords. And Jim recognized her tone, that quiet attempt to keep dignity intact even if it meant walking away in pain. It was the same tone he had heard from wounded Marines who tried to refuse being carried to safety because they didn't want to weigh down the men around them. The moment balanced perfectly on the edge between pride and compassion, between walking away and stepping forward, between silence and action. And inside this small-town pharmacy, under humming fluorescent lights and rows of greeting cards, a retired Marine made the silent decision that he would not allow a Gold Star mother to carry humiliation out the door. Not today. Not in his presence. Not in the country her son defended with his life. Jim advanced just enough to stand within the cashier's clear view, careful to keep his shoulders squared and his voice pitched low, because what mattered most right now was the atmosphere of respect he built around Evelyn rather than the mechanics of payment. He chose his words with precision the way he once chose radio calls in the field, understanding that a single phrase could either protect someone's dignity or shatter it. "Let's take care of this properly," he murmured to the cashier, eyes flicking once to the bag and once to the register, as if this were an ordinary adjustment rather than a moral turning point. He did not say, "I'm paying," and he did not gesture toward Evelyn. Instead, he framed the moment as a necessary correction, a matter-of-fact step that any decent community would recognize as the right next move. The cashier slowed her hands and steadied her breathing, as if her fingers themselves understood they had crossed into sacred ground. She knew Evelyn's story, and in the instant Jim spoke, she sensed a path that could protect the woman's privacy without turning her into a spectacle. Her eyes softened, but her tone remained professional, a deliberate choice, because kindness that becomes too obvious can wound where it intends to heal. "I can hold it for a minute," she replied, glancing toward the pharmacist, who paused his work and gave the smallest nod a leader can give when he wants to authorize compassion while keeping rules intact. Procedure bent, not by breaking, but by bowing to higher principle. Around them, the pharmacy line shifted into a different kind of silence, not impatient, not awkward, but reverent, as if the whole room had remembered at once how to be the kind of town their grandparents would recognize. The lineman's foot stopped tapping. Then his cap dipped slightly as if he'd unconsciously removed it for a prayer he could feel but not hear. The teenager straightened his posture, phone forgotten, attention locked on the way a man with a quiet voice could change the temperature of a room. The mother with the toddler moved her cart a half step back, creating space as though making a corridor for dignity to pass without brushing against anything that might snag and tear. Jim centered the language on honor owed, not charity given. "Her son served," he said softly, and the phrase did what no lecture ever could. It placed the conversation on the ground of debt and gratitude rather than pity and need. The cashier's face changed at once. The words connected the dots she already knew, and the history she remembered joined the present she was living. The pharmacist's chin lifted in the same quiet agreement. "Yes, this is not a discount, not a favor, not a workaround. This is the community acknowledging the cost already paid." Evelyn heard the words like a hand placed gently on her shoulder, steadying her without forcing her still. Instinct told her to refuse, to insist she was fine, to preserve control by cutting the moment short, but the way Jim spoke disarmed her resistance. He did not aim attention at her, did not parade his intentions, did not perform goodness for a crowd. He simply built a shield around her with language sturdy enough to carry weight. In that shield, she could breathe again, not as a recipient of charity, but as a mother whose family, the larger American family, understood what was due. The room seemed to inhale and hold, as if every person present was waiting to see whether this delicate construction would hold under the pressure of policy and pride. Small towns have long memories about moments like this. They become stories told softly at suppers and church halls, not as gossip, but as reminders of who they want to remain. The scanner didn't beep. The bell over the door didn't ring. Even the fluorescent hum felt quieter. The moral atmosphere thickened in a way that made people stand a little straighter without knowing why. Jim kept the conversation anchored in procedure to keep emotions from spilling over. "We'll need a separate receipt," he added, tone even and practical. "And please bag it discreetly." The details mattered. A second bag. A folded slip. No elevated volume. No eyes pulled toward the counter by unnecessary movement. The way you handle the mechanics either preserves a person's dignity or it doesn't, and he had no intention of leaving anything to chance. The cashier nodded, already reaching for the extra bag with the unhurried care of someone laying out a flag. The pharmacist stepped forward just enough to be seen and not heard, his presence a silent endorsement that gave the cashier cover. He adjusted the screen, tapped a code, and prepared the register path that would allow the transaction to move without summoning managerial scrutiny. Policy is often blamed for coldness, but people of conscience can find the warmest route through it when they agree on the destination. With the route set, the pharmacist returned to his station, not to hide, but to stand watch over the boundary they had just defended. Evelyn felt the smallest measure of relief break across her chest. Not because the money had been solved. She still didn't want anyone to pay, but because the way they were doing it made it bearable. She could accept this if it wasn't framed as rescue. She could receive this if it wasn't displayed like a spectacle. She could allow the community to carry a fraction of the weight if the act itself honored the reason the weight existed in the first place. Pride did not vanish. It was simply met by something older and stronger, belonging. The line, as one body, seemed to exhale at last. No applause, no comments, no performative nods. Just a collective understanding that they had stood witness to something that required them to be still and let honor do its work. In that breath, the town quietly chose sides, not against Evelyn's pride, but alongside it, and the next step in this story became inevitable. The moment where words give way to decisive action. The moment where a Marine stops describing what should happen and ensures that it does. Evelyn's hand hovered near her coat collar as if she might still gather herself and leave. One last attempt to keep control by escaping before this kindness could fully land. The tug of war within her was fierce. Survive with help or suffer alone with pride intact. She shifted a step toward the aisle, but the movement stalled when Jim's voice reached her. Soft, steady, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't come from rank anymore, but from a lifetime of earning the right to speak plainly. "Ma'am," he said, and the single word carried respect enough to make her pause without feeling cornered. The whole room felt that pause, the fulcrum of the story settling into place. He did not address her need. He addressed her honor. "Your boy served this country," he said, still quiet, still careful. Eyes not searching for an audience, only for her. The sentence rearranged the moral furniture of the moment. It took the spotlight off Evelyn's lack and placed it squarely on her family's gift. It turned what looked like a deficit into a credit already on the ledger of the nation. She did not flinch, but her eyes glossed as the words connected the present humiliation to the sacred past, binding them so that help could be accepted as tribute, not as charity. The energy in the pharmacy shifted again, and this time it was permanent. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered. The protest shaped more by habit than by conviction, because people who have carried grief for years learn to mistrust relief when it finally arrives. The admission landed like a fragile glass figure set on a narrow shelf, beautiful, breakable, beloved, and Jim knew if he pushed too hard, it would fall and shatter. He didn't push. "You're not," he answered, with the gentle firmness of a man who refuses to argue with a falsehood. "Your family." The word did not need explanation. In small-town America, family reaches beyond blood to include the people who stand with you when your strength fades. She shook her head once, barely, the gesture of someone testing whether this new framing could hold the weight of her fear. All her life she had given more than she took, to her church, to her neighbors, to her son's memory, and the idea of taking now felt like a betrayal of the self she had worked so hard to protect. But what Jim offered was not a transaction. It was a restoration. He was not asking her to receive from him. He was asking the town, through him, to honor what had already been given. That distinction slid past her defenses like sunlight through lace curtains, warming the room without blinding her. The cashier, sensing that the hinge of the moment had turned, moved with the quiet efficiency of someone covering a friend with a blanket before dawn's chill can settle in. She prepared the separate receipt, folded it so it would not flash obvious text, and set the second bag nearby with a gentle hand. The pharmacist coordinated the register path so no extra beeps would puncture the silence. Protocol and compassion braided together like rope sharing a load, each strand stronger because the other existed. Even so, Evelyn's resistance flared once more, the last flame of pride refusing to go out without asserting its light. She took a breath that almost turned into a sob and caught it mid-rise, pressing her lips into a line that said she would rather fracture in private than be held together in public. For a heartbeat, it looked as if she would bolt, autographed by humiliation and escorted by shame, the darkest moment arriving not with thunder, but with the terrible quiet of a door about to close. Jim stepped that final half-stride that closes the distance between witness and actor. "Ring it up on mine," he said to the cashier, the words gentle but absolute, as if they had already been entered into the ledger and reality merely needed to catch up. He didn't move closer to Evelyn. He did not touch her. He did not force a response. Instead, he provided instructions that protected her. Separate bag, separate receipt, no need to announce a thing. He removed performance from the scene, leaving only reverence, the one element that can carry help without bruising the one who receives it. Evelyn's eyes brimmed, and for once she did not blink them clear. The tears were not defeat. They were released saltwater proof that the human heart recognizes truth when it hears it. She nodded, not to surrender, but to assent, the way one might nod at the end of a prayer when the words have finally reached the place they were meant to heal. The cashier completed the sale with hands that almost looked like they were blessing an altar, not a counter, and set the bag within Evelyn's reach the way a friend places something precious back where it belongs. No applause followed, no comments, no lesson delivered aloud. The room did not need narration, it needed stillness. And in that stillness, the moral arc completed its pivot. Humiliation had met witness. Witness had chosen intervention, and intervention had restored dignity. The narrative did not end there, but its heart had turned toward hope in a way that could not be undone. Evelyn felt lighter, not because the price had been paid, but because the story had been refrained into the language she could accept: family, service, belonging. Jim did not leave the moment half-finished. A Marine's duty is not to put out the flames of a fire, only to leave the embers smoldering. It is to ensure the house is safe by sunrise. As Evelyn steadied her breathing and prepared to take the bag, he was already planning the next call, the one that would turn a single act into a sustained answer. But for now, in this breath held by a town that remembered its soul, the pivot stood complete. She would not walk out empty-handed, and she would not walk out embarrassed. She would walk out as who she truly was, a mother honored by the country her son served. The bell above the door did not ring yet, because the chapter was not finished. The cashier slid the receipt into a small envelope instead of placing it on top. The pharmacist returned to his station with eyes a little brighter, and the witnesses let out the quietest sighs, the kind people release when they've seen something right done the right way. In the space where pride had once clenched its fist, gratitude opened a hand, and the story, now set back on its rails, rolled forward toward its resolution with the steady confidence of truth. The Marine had spoken, the town had listened, and honor had pivoted the day. With the emotional pivot complete, and the line now aligned behind the Marine's leadership without a single spoken vote, Jim shifted his stance just slightly, the subtle physical change from observer to actor, and stepped into his role with the calm assurance of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions under pressure. He approached the counter not with urgency, but with that quiet, controlled certainty that tells everyone involved that this is the moment where talk ends and action begins. "Ring it on mine," he said again to the cashier. Not louder, not sharper, just resolute, because real authority doesn't shout. It confirms. The cashier picked up the bag as if she were handling something sacred, and in a way, she was, because this was not just medicine anymore. It represented restored dignity. It represented a correction of injustice. It represented the bridge between individual pride and community responsibility. She placed the bag into the second discreet paper sack Jim had requested, folded it carefully, and made sure no one else would be able to see which medication was inside. The details mattered because privacy was not a courtesy here, it was a shield. As she printed the separate receipt, neatly, quietly, she slid it forward toward Jim with the same careful grace someone might use when handing off a folded flag. Jim accepted it the same way, not with casual fingers, but with the slow, deliberate grip of a man who understands that some transactions are not financial at their core. They are ceremonial. They are moral. They are the kind of moments that mark a line between who we are and who we refuse to become. He pulled out his worn leather wallet, the kind Marines tend to keep far longer than most civilians, edges softened by time, stitching pulled slightly in the corners, the surface shaped by years of being tucked into uniform pockets overseas. Inside that wallet was not just money. It was the quiet evidence of a lifetime of earned meaning. He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch at the total. He didn't calculate whether it was convenient. He simply paid. The cashier accepted the payment without a single sympathetic phrase, because she understood that in moments like this, words can cheapen what has just been done. The pharmacist, watching from the back counter, nodded once when the drawer closed, a simple acknowledgement that the transaction had completed properly, not because it fit protocol perfectly, but because it fit humanity perfectly. Rules bowed to righteousness. Evelyn watched, unable to speak, hands trembling just slightly, not because she was weak, but because she had just witnessed someone remove humiliation from her shoulders as gracefully as a person lifting a coat from a friend's back. She didn't reach for the bag yet. She wasn't ready to accept it physically, because acceptance wasn't about fingers closing around paper. It was about allowing her heart to recognize that this act came not from pity, but from reverence. Jim slid the bag a little closer to her on the counter, not pushing it toward her, not insisting, simply positioning it where she could take it when she was ready. His eyes stayed on her face only briefly, then respectfully shifted away, giving her space to compose herself without the piercing vulnerability of direct attention. That choice, that restraint, was what protected her dignity more than anything else. No one in the line shifted or sighed. The lineman held his cap respectfully against his chest. The teenager stood straighter than he'd stood all day at school. The mother looked at her toddler and thought about the kind of world she wanted her child to grow up inside. They were not watching as spectators. They were participating through silence. The entire town, represented in that line, was now aligned behind this moment. Evelyn finally reached out, slow, deliberate, and her fingers gently wrapped around the small paper sack. In that moment, acceptance was transformed from weakness into honor. She did not thank Jim out loud, because some gratitude is not meant for speech. It is meant to be carried quietly inside the heart. And with that, the pivotal transaction was complete. But Jim knew the moral responsibility did not end here, because true service never ends with a single gesture. It continues, it sustains, it ensures the need is not just met today, but prevented from returning tomorrow. When Evelyn stepped aside with her medicine, and the cashier began slowly resetting her station for the next customer, Jim didn't immediately walk toward the exit. Marines do not leave the field mid-mission. He stepped 3 feet away from the counter into the quieter corner near the rack of seasonal cards. drew his phone from his pocket, and scrolled to a number he kept stored not because he used it often, but because he knew someday he might need it for exactly a moment like this. The Marine Corps' League Detachment Commander. His voice was still low. He didn't announce anything to the room, but those who stood close enough overheard bits of the one-sided conversation, and they recognized the tone. Not informality, not casual social call. Business. Honor business. Memory business. "We have a Gold Star mother here," he said, using the identification not as a tag, but as a password to open a door of responsibility. "She's on heart meds, copay jumped. I've covered today, but we need 90 days of follow-through." The phrasing wasn't emotional, it was operational. The detachment commander on the other end. Older voice, steady tone, no questions asked, didn't need explanation. Marines share language that compresses miles into seconds. "We'll handle it," he said. Just those 3 words, because among men who've served, confirmation doesn't require punctuation. Logistics start moving the moment acknowledgement is spoken. And Jim hung up knowing he had turned this from a momentary rescue into a structured solution. Not charity. Not one-time gesture. System echo. The pharmacist, watching from across the counter, recognized what had happened without needing to hear the entire conversation. He nodded again, not to signal agreement, but to signal that this was the way help should be done. Not temporary, not conditional, but foundational. He typed a discreet note into the internal patient file to flag future copay coordination through the detachment if needed, not replacing the system, but cushioning the fall before it could occur again. Evelyn held the bag close to her coat, still not speaking, eyes shining with that deep water mixture of grief relieved and gratitude restrained. She had not just been protected from humiliation, she had been protected from repeat humiliation. And that difference mattered more than any single payment could, because it meant this wasn't a one-day reprieve. It was a barrier placed between her and future despair. It meant she didn't have to plan how she would scrape money together next month. It meant she didn't have to choose between groceries and survival again in 30 days. The lineman in the back of the line quietly removed his cap entirely now, holding it respectfully at his side, not out of patriotic performative duty, but because he understood. Something sacred had occurred. The high school student made a silent promise to himself that if he was ever grown enough to make decisions like this, he would choose to act the same way. The mother hugged her toddler closer, knowing that this was how character is built, not by speeches, but by watching men stand up for what is right. Jim slipped his phone back into his pocket, exhaled once, short, steady, and stepped back toward the counter long enough to give the cashier a small nod of finality. "It's handled," he said, 3 words simple enough to sound like ordinary conversation, but heavy enough to mark the completion of an operation. She nodded back with the solemn, quiet respect of someone who recognized she'd just helped write a page in the unspoken moral history of the town. Evelyn turned toward the door then, not weighed down by defeat, but supported by a community she didn't realize was ready to stand with her. The bell above the pharmacy entrance chimed when she stepped out into the winter air, but this time the sound wasn't a punctuation of sorrow. It was a benediction, a release, a confirmation that the moment had been resolved with dignity preserved on all sides. No one applauded. No one thanked anyone. The witnesses simply let the moment settle into their hearts like a candle lit inside a quiet chapel, because they knew this day would now become a whisper passed forward at VFW breakfasts, church suppers, and across kitchen tables. The story had moved from private scene to shared truth, and the echo had officially begun. And as the door closed behind Evelyn, the town itself, in the hearts of the people standing there, silently recommitted to the unspoken American principle that had just been proven again. Honor is not something the nation owes her. It is something she already earned long ago. The bell above the pharmacy door chimed once, releasing Evelyn into the crisp evening air as she stepped onto the sidewalk outside, clutching the small pharmacy bag close to her chest like it held something far more sacred than medication. She had come in carrying a private tension, fearful, protective, bracing herself for disappointment, and she walked out carrying restored dignity, not because the price had changed, not because her circumstances had magically improved, but because someone stood watch when she had reached the edge of her strength. The cold winter wind met her cheeks with a sharp sting, yet her heart felt warmer than it had in months. Not warm with pride, but with relief, because relief is what happens when burdens are lifted quietly and respectfully. Inside, the pharmacy did not suddenly erupt into conversation or applause. Instead, the silence left behind became a kind of holy echo, a fragile stillness that people instinctively protect after witnessing something that matters. The cashier straightened her counter slowly, placing each item back into place in deliberate movements, as though she didn't want to jostle the stillness that lingered in the air. The pharmacist resumed reviewing dosage interactions, but his eyes held the soft reflection of someone who had just seen the world turn toward goodness, if only for a moment. The lineman stepped forward next, but he didn't place his item on the counter immediately. Instead, he paused for one respectful second, as if acknowledging that the ground he was standing on needed one heartbeat more before returning to ordinary life. And then, with a simple nod to the cashier, he began his transaction, his voice low, his tone softened, because witnessing honor reshapes a man, even if he never speaks about it. The world did not change loudly, but it changed. The teenager in the school jacket slid his phone back into his pocket, suddenly uninterested in whatever controlled his attention a few minutes earlier. He didn't say anything either, because this wasn't the kind of moment teenagers post online. This was the kind of moment they carry quietly into adulthood, letting it shape their understanding of what adulthood means. He had just seen a Marine live his values silently, and that image would stay long after digital noise faded away. Even the mother with the toddler seemed to stand taller in the checkout line. She looked down at her child, her eyes soft, and without meaning to. She squeezed the small hand just a little tighter, because raising kids is not just about teaching them grammar or tying shoelaces. It is about showing them what it looks like to be good. And she knew that someday, when her child was old enough to understand, she would tell this story, not as gossip, but as instruction. Gradually, the atmosphere returned to motion, but not to normal, because normal was too small a word for what had just happened. The room returned to sound, scanner beeps, the rustle of bags, muted conversations, but the memory of the moment still hovered above the counter, like a light that didn't need electricity to remain lit. Small towns do not need newspapers to spread stories like this. They travel through nods, through shared glances, through quiet retellings over coffee and pie, through the invisible network of respect that binds a community tighter than any official ordinance ever could. And in that way, this moment, simple, unannounced, unadvertised, began walking down Main Street before Evelyn even reached the corner. Honor doesn't need headlines to take root. It simply needs witness. And everyone who stood in that line had become a witness, not to someone's suffering, but to someone else's courage to intervene. They would not tell the story to elevate themselves. They would tell it to remind each other who they are supposed to be. That's how moral culture is transmitted in rural America, not through slogans, but through memory. When Evelyn reached the crosswalk, she paused, letting the winter breeze settle the last remnants of trembling in her hands. Her son had once walked into battlefields far from home. Today, someone walked into her battle, quietly, without asking for permission, without demanding recognition. And the echo of that truth followed her home like a steady heartbeat. The pharmacy door eventually closed behind Jim as he exited. Not triumphantly, not theatrically, but with the gentle posture of a man simply fulfilling the duty that remained etched into his bones. No one needed to say goodbye or praise him. They had already understood. And the ripple, born inside that small store under humming fluorescent lights, would continue long after the receipt printer cooled. Word of what happened did not spread like rumor. It spread like a quiet affirmation, carried carefully by the people who had been present, told in low tones over supper tables, during church fellowship coffee, and in the back rows of VFW breakfasts. No one needed to exaggerate it, because the truth itself was already powerful enough to stand without embellishment. A Marine stepped in, they would say, leaving out names and leaving out spectacle, because the story wasn't about individuals. It was about what it means to be part of a country that remembers sacrifice and responds to it. The Marine Corps' League detachment fulfilled the commitment just as Jim intended. 90 days, 3 full cycles of prescription, covered quietly and reliably. And when the pharmacy next rang up the order, there was no awkwardness, no hesitation, no return of humiliation, because the protocol had been established. The pharmacist simply tagged the line item. The cashier smiled a small, respectful smile. And Evelyn walked away again with dignity intact, not rescued, but honored. The second person the detachment helped, an older Korean War veteran, struggling with oxygen medication copay, never even knew the full story. All he knew was that someone called and said the detachment fund would cover it for a while. And that was the sign that this moment had graduated from event to tradition. Because when goodness becomes protocol, goodness becomes culture, and culture sustains itself. In the months that followed, a subtle change occurred in that small pharmacy. Not loud, not institutional, but deeply felt. When someone in line hesitated at a total, the cashier's tone softened instinctively. When a heartbroken widow or elderly veteran placed a hand on their wallet and whispered, "Maybe next week," others in line didn't look away, they looked toward. Because one moment had retrained their reflexes, and reflexes are the truest evidence of moral shift. Evelyn never spoke publicly about the day. She never turned it into a story about her hardship. She never allowed the moment to be used as sentimental attention. Instead, she folded the memory inside herself next to the folded flag that sat on her mantel. And every morning when light touched that flag, she remembered that service is not a one-direction sacrifice. Sometimes it returns home in different forms, carried by different hands, still wearing the same honor. Jim, for his part, never bragged, never referenced it, never allowed anyone to put his name in the center of the retelling. Marines do not build legacies through publicity. They build them through continuity. He simply lived his days with the same quiet integrity, knowing that somewhere, perhaps not far away, another American might someday need another moment of dignified intervention. And he would be ready. The young student who witnessed it that day grew older, and when he later told the story, he didn't describe prices or details. He described the way the Marine's voice sounded when he said, "Her boy served." That was the sentence that stayed with him, because that one line taught him that honor is not nostalgia. Honor is a responsibility alive in the present tense. The town didn't create a plaque or a memorial. They didn't need to. Instead, they did something more meaningful. They changed the quiet rules of how they treat one another. They replaced indifference with attentiveness. They replaced polite avoidance with careful presence. They replaced the idea that it's none of my business with the understanding that sometimes it absolutely is. And so the echo continued, through hearts, through habits, through small decisions made in grocery aisles and hardware store lines and church foyers, because goodness, once witnessed, becomes contagious. In the end, this story stands as a reminder, not of dramatic heroism, but of simple American truth. Honor does not retire. Service does not expire. And the most powerful moments of national character are rarely televised or announced. They occur in fluorescent corners of everyday life, when someone who once wore the uniform recognizes that the battlefield has changed, but the mission has not.